In case you haven't heard the news, best-selling author and founder Jamie Kern Lima launched her podcast a week ago. And now she has the title of top podcaster to add to her long list of credentials. The real question, though, that we're going to answer inside this episode is how did she claim the #1 spot in U.S. self-improvement and top 20 of all podcasts in the USA and hold it for over a week? I'm breaking it all down and more inside this episode, so don't go anywhere. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. In case you've never heard of Jamie Kern Lima, she is a company founder turned best-selling author, she's a speaker, and now she's a podcaster who sold her brand It Cosmetics to L'Oreal for $1.2 billion in cash back in 2016. And since then, she has been traveling the globe, sharing stories of inspiration and of how to overcome self-doubt and of never giving up on every stage that she speaks on and in her books as well. And because of it, she's been able to build a very loyal following of almost 1 million people and counting across her social media platforms. And last week, she made her debut into the world of podcasting. Now, her first guest was Oprah, if that gives you any clue into how well connected Jamie is. Now, to be totally clear, Jamie and we don't know each other. I did not work with her to help her launch her podcast, but I watched her launch, and I can tell you every single mechanism that was at work to help her claim the top spot in one of the most competitive categories in the US, self-improvement, and to be in the top 20 on Spotify, and to be in the top 20 of all podcasts in the USA, and hold that spot for over a week and counting. I'm also going to point out why comparing your podcast launch to a launch like Jamie's is not a true apples to apples comparison. And we're going to break down what you need to look at instead outside of downloads and chart positions to determine the true success of your podcast launch. Because when it comes to launching a podcast, there are a few things that you need to understand. 5 things specifically. Number 1, follows are important. That little button at the top right corner when you are on the Apple Podcast app, or kind of at the middle on the left if you are on the Spotify app, that follow button is so crucial. And people don't understand why it is so important to get people following your show. It comes with a whole host of implications, no pun intended, but hitting that follow button is important because what it indicates to the podcast players is intent to listen. This is key. That's number 1. Number 2, listens and downloads are important. They are crucial in a launch because it indicates engagement. So this is how Apple and Spotify measure the engagement of your listeners, measure the engagement levels of your content. Apple and Spotify are no different from social media in that they want to keep people on the platform as long as possible. Number 3, completion rate. This is also important because when listeners complete episodes, this is an indicator to Apple and Spotify of content quality. If listeners are dropping off in the first minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes of an episode, this is an indicator that you either have low quality content, low quality audio, or maybe you have good content, but it's littered with way too many ads and affiliate promotions. Or maybe you were rambling for 17 minutes before you actually get to the point of what the episode is about. So completion rate is really, really key. And this is why whenever we work with clients, this is something we are looking at on the back end to help them dial in so that you can figure out exactly how long your episodes need to be for your audience to help get those completion rates up and keep them high. Number 4, ratings and reviews. Now, these are for social proof. A lot of people tend to think this has to do with the success of a launch or that these have to do with getting on the charts. But ratings and reviews do not directly impact chart positions or rankings. They are important because just like when you go to buy something on Amazon, what's the first thing you do? You scroll down and you read the reviews. People do the same when it comes to podcasts. And if they see enough good reviews, then they tend to think, okay, this must be a decent enough show. Maybe it is worth my time if it's worth all of these other people's time who have also taken the time to say good things about it. So ratings and reviews are for social proof, but they don't directly impact your ability to rank on the chart. So I want to make that very clear. And then 5th and finally, your chart position is simply a measure of your show's popularity. The charts are not a measure of the largest podcasts. They are not a measure of which podcasts have the most listeners. They are not a measure of any kind of all-time listening record or how long a podcast has been around. They are simply a mere measure of a show's popularity. Think of this similarly to if a piece of content goes viral on Instagram or TikTok. Instagram or TikTok is going to show that piece of content to more people because it was a popular piece of content. People were engaging with it. So therefore, if enough people engage with it, well, the algorithm concludes, well, more people will want to engage with it. So let's share it with more people because the goal is to keep people on the platform as long as possible. So Apple and Spotify are no different in that sense. So these are the 5 things. When it comes to launching, you need to understand not only what these 5 things are, but the implications of each and why each one is important. But there's something else you need to know too. You need to also know that there are 2 types of podcasts. The first type is a show where the audience grows the podcast. And the second type is a show where the podcast grows the audience. Skip back 10 seconds and listen to that again. This is critical because if you caught the episode 2 episodes back where I broke down the additional differences between podcasts in this great divide that we're starting to see emerging in our creator economy, then you also know that there is a major difference between independent niche podcasts and podcasts that are run by a celebrity or that are part of a major network or both. So in case you missed that episode, it's worth the listen. I will link to it in the show notes for you because not all podcasts are created equal. And this is really important to understand because you might otherwise look at a podcast launch like Jamie's and feel like, oh my gosh, I stand absolutely no chance. And you might be tempted to compare your show to a podcast like Jamie's or any of the big celebrity run shows or influencer run shows and feel discouraged because you're like, I'm just not seeing the same kind of growth. And you'd be surprised, but a lot of people don't understand this. In fact, I had a client get really concerned last week when she realized her launch was planned for the same day as Jamie's. And I told her, there's no need to worry because number one, your podcast is completely different from Jamie's in that yours is an independent niche podcast designed to grow your audience, whereas hers is a celebrity influencer run podcast where the audience is already built in to grow the podcast. And I also told her the other reason we have no need to worry here is because you are positioned in a completely different category than Jamie's. But this is one thing that a lot of hosts don't realize, is that if you are positioned in a particular category and you are comparing your podcast to another top podcast that's positioned in a different category, it's not a true apples to apples comparison. So just in case you're not familiar with the categories and how these work and how these influence the charts and how these are ranked across the charts, the top charts, if you log into Apple and you look at the top shows, it'll say top shows. These shows are looking at the top shows across all categories. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of categories. And you can think of a category like a genre of music. It's a way to categorize different types of shows. But then there are also the category charts. And these are the charts that are specific to the category that your show is positioned in. So Jamie dominated the self-improvement category. And as such, because she dominated that category, she also earned a spot in the top charts of all categories. But like I told our student, I said, guess what? You stand an equal chance of ranking because you are positioned in a totally different category. Now, if you were in the same category, that's a different story, and we would have to go back and make sure our strategy is dialed in so that you would stand a chance against launching with someone that's coming in with a bigger audience and a lot more traction than you may be pulling into the algorithm on the same day. Because within a given category, you're competing with the other podcasts in that given category. But a lot of people don't understand this, so they just kind of lump all these categories together and the charts, quote unquote, the charts together as one collective, not realizing that there are nuances from category to category and every category is different. And I know that I talk about the charts a lot here on the show because the charts are the number 2 avenue of discoverability for your podcast. But I want you to hear me when I say that the charts are not the best measure of the success of a podcast. This is so key. And it's easy to think that the charts are kind of like the gold standard in podcasting because you see these big shows on the charts week after week and we all want that same kind of credibility and we want that same kind of clout. But I promise you, every podcast expert that I know, including myself, only looks at the charts as one facet of a much bigger picture. It's one piece of the puzzle. The charts are not the whole puzzle. So if you are an independent podcaster and you are not a celebrity, and if you have a niche podcast and not a general one, and if you are podcasting for lead generation and audience building and not just to have the title of podcaster behind your name, then it does you no good to compare your show to a podcast like Jamie's that's run by a celebrity for a general audience with the sole purpose of increased credibility. So now that we've got this out of the way, let's go back to something I said at the start of this episode, is that you need to know about the two different types of podcasts as well. The one where the audience grows the podcast, and the other where the podcast grows the audience. In other words, some podcasts come with a built-in audience. Other podcasts do not. The one thing, though, that these both do have in common, and why this is important for you to know, is traffic. Because traffic drives rankings. Traffic drives the charts because traffic lends to engagement. Jamie Kern Lima had a built-in audience when she launched her podcast. She launched her podcast to a built-in audience and therefore grew instantly and had instant traffic. It's kind of like you turn on the faucet and boom, there's the water. It's pouring out. But there are other podcasts, top podcasts, who did not come with a built-in audience. Amy Porterfield started podcasting long before viral platforms like TikTok and Threads hit the scene. Jordan Harbinger has been podcasting before just about every single social media platform other than Facebook. He had his podcast before Twitter, which is now X, long before Snapchat or Instagram or any of these other platforms. Alex Hormozy, same thing. He had his podcast before he started going viral on social media and growing his audience. All of these podcasts started with a different intention. They didn't start as another credibility play or a feather in their cap. They started to grow their audience. In other words, these podcasts functioned as the pipe structure needed for the water to flow to and through. So what I want you to notice is that these podcasts are still ultra successful. Neither you nor I would deny that Amy Porterfield does not have a successful podcast, or Jordan Harbinger with over 15 million downloads a month. Neither of us would say, oh, he doesn't have a successful podcast. But they didn't come with a built-in audience eager to consume all of their content on day one. And this is why everything I teach here on this show is not for the person with the built-in audience. It's for the person who's using the podcast to build the audience. Because it can be done, and it can be done well, and it can be done to the same degree of success. But it will take time. And here's the thing. Jamie built an audience, and guess what? That also took time. She just built it through a different mechanism. And this is why you've got to understand this if you are here to grow your podcast and you're here to grow it for the long term. People like Jamie spent years building her audience before hitting publish on her podcast. Other people launched the podcast to build the audience, and it takes years. So the bottom line, no matter how you choose to build the audience, it takes years. So we need to separate activity from result here. Building the audience is the activity, and there are a number of ways to do that. So if you build your audience first through other methods and then launch your podcast will look like an overnight success. But if you choose the podcast as the activity that builds the audience, it's going to take some time to build. But then guess what? When you have that audience and you go to launch your book, well, your book will look like an overnight success. So we have to understand the mechanisms at work here. A big audience does not equal a successful podcast. Otherwise, we wouldn't have podcasters like Amy and Jordan and Alex who started with no audience. So the question for you is, if you don't have a huge audience like Jamie and you want to launch a podcast, and we know that traffic is going to be the driver of that podcast's ability to get discovered early on and long term, then the question is, how can you give yourself the best chance of getting your show discovered by new listeners? The focus should not be on, oh my gosh, I don't have a big enough audience yet. This podcast is going to be a failure. The focus should be on, how can I leverage the audience I have in order to get discovered? And what else can I do to get my podcast discovered early on? And there are multiple ways you can do this. One simple thing you can do is SEO. First of all, know who you're speaking to, know who you're podcasting for, and know what search terms they're looking for. And plug that in everywhere from your podcast name to your show descriptions to your episode titles. Another thing that you absolutely non-negotiably will want to do is have an intentional launch strategy for your podcast, where you are picking a specific day and you're spending 3 or 4 weeks prior to that day building traction and traffic for your launch. We've helped over 6 dozen entrepreneurs and experts learn how to launch in the top 100 and turn their shows into their number one source of organic leads with these 2 methods. And helping people with no audience have the same kind of success that people like Jamie with a built-in audience are having with their podcasts. So what I want you to do is shift your focus from getting on the charts to getting discovered. How do I get discovered? Because you're never going to get on the charts if people don't know you exist. And I mentioned earlier that the charts are the number 2 avenue of discoverability. You know what's number 1? Search. That's why SEO is one of our favorite methods for getting discovered, because the more you can optimize your ability to show up in your specific listeners' search queries, the more chance you'll have of those listeners being able to find and listen to your podcast. So what all of this comes down to is one question, which you might be wondering in the back of your mind right now. Well, Courtney, okay, what actually determines a successful launch then? And the answer, my friend, is that you get to decide. For some people, it is finally simply bringing this dream to life, getting their podcast out into the world that they've thought about doing for 2, 3, 4 years, and it's finally happening. For others, it is breaking outside of their warm audience and finally being able to reach cold audiences, to build another platform that they own, that they control, that they do not have to play the never-ending social media game, creating short-form content that gets buried in the news feed after 24 hours and drives no leads and no traffic. For others, it's being able to take full ownership of their voice and to be held accountable to using it and to showing up for their audience in the way that they want to show up. For others, it's getting new leads to their business within the first week of launching. For others, it's being able to establish themselves or elevate themselves as an expert in their niche. So the charts are not the only measure of success. In fact, they're one of the worst measures because they fluctuate every week. They're not easy to measure. Yes, it can help with discoverability, and this is why everything that I teach you is designed to help you increase your ranking potential on the charts. But this is also why, because some people don't know how to rank, they don't know, okay, there's no rhyme or reason to it. I've ranked once, but it was like years ago and it only ever happened once. And this is why some people turn to measuring downloads. But downloads aren't the best measure of success either. In fact, it's been researched and proven by companies like Nielsen and Edison that smaller niche podcasts have higher engagement and conversions than podcasts with bigger, broader audiences. So numbers are relative. And this is why understanding these apples to apples comparisons is so important. Because the charts and the downloads, these can be valuable data points in building a long-term growth strategy. And certainly it is fun to see your podcast on the charts, especially when it's next to these big names. But if that's the only data point that you're using to measure the success of your podcast, you're going to get really frustrated really fast. So the only measuring stick that you should be using to measure the success of your podcast, you ready for it? It's you against you. It's you against your personal best. Are you growing month over month? Are you growing year over year? If the answer is yes, keep doubling down on what's working. If the answer is no, and you're committed to making your podcast work, ask for help. My team would be happy to sit down and have a conversation with you to help you find the blind spots that maybe you are unable to see or don't know to look for, and to develop a plan to grow beyond them. And if you want to grab time on our calendar, just head to the show notes, click the link. Because at the end of the day, your personal best against your personal best is the only metric that matters. And speaking of the success of your podcast, if you've ever wished that you could just take a peek behind the scenes at what people like Alex Hormozy or Patrick Lencioni do to grow their podcasts, well, your wish is my command. Because in the next episode, the podcast expert and strategist who oversees the Hormozy and Lencioni podcast is joining me in the studio to teach you how to create a podcast that doesn't just capture attention, but that can dominate the conversation. So if you're serious about mastering your craft as a host and making your podcast your #1 marketing channel, then head on over to the next episode and let's make your business binge-worthy.